June 18, 2026, Nevado Tocllaraju, Peru. 5:40 in the morning. A satellite distress signal fired from 6,000 meters above sea level. The man who sent it survived. The two people with him did not. The Cordillera Blanca is the highest tropical mountain range on Earth. Dozens of peaks above 5,000 meters. Routes that draw elite mountaineers from every corner of the planet. June is supposed to be the safe window. The dry season, lower storm risk, stable conditions. Not the chaos of the wet season, not the brutal cold of winter. June is when serious climbers come to the Cordillera Blanca, because the mountain is supposed to give them a fair fight. Daniel Navarro and Sandra Covone had planned their entire expedition around it. But then everything changed. The part I find most extraordinary about this story is not that an avalanche struck. It is that these two had done almost everything right. This was not a failure of preparation. It was something more troubling than that. This is the story of the tragedy on Tokaraju and what it tells us about a mountain range that is running out of margin. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. Tokaraju sits at 6,034 meters in the Ancash region of Peru, inside Huascarán National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that contains the greatest concentration of tropical glaciers on Earth. The mountain's name comes from the Quechua language, Tukla, meaning trap, and Raju, meaning snow or ice. Roughly translated, it means a mountain trapped by snow. It was first climbed in July of 1939 by two German mountaineers, Walter Brecht and Hans Schweitzer, via the Northwest Ridge, a route classified as alpine difficult. For experienced climbers, Tokaraju is considered a premier classic in the Cordillera Blanca. Not the easiest objective in the range, but not beyond the reach of a serious, well-prepared team either. The standard route requires technical ice climbing, particularly above 5,900 meters. Summit days here are among the longest and most demanding of any expedition in the park. What makes Tokaraju genuinely hard is not just the altitude. Though at over 6,000 meters, the atmosphere holds barely half the oxygen available at sea level. It is the terrain near the top, large bergschrunds cut across the upper mountain. Those are the highest crevasses on a glacier, the fractured zones where a slow-moving ice field tears away from the more stable ice anchored to the rock below. They frequently stop teams short of the final few hundred feet of the summit, and above the bergschrunds, the ridgeline narrows. Traverses across exposed sections of ice and snow become unavoidable. The part that I find most striking about this mountain specifically is that its name, Trap of Snow, almost reads like a warning that has been there since long before the first climber ever set foot on it. So, who were Daniel Navarro and Sandra Covone, and what had brought them to Peru? Daniel was a Mexican national, 45 years old, with roughly 2.5 decades of experience in high-altitude mountaineering. Sandra was a Canadian, 33 years old. They were a couple who had climbed together across multiple ranges and multiple continents. This was not a bucket list trip. This was not a commercial guided package for first-time summit seekers. These were serious, committed athletes pursuing an objective they had clearly been building toward over a long period of time. They had flown to Peru, traveled deep into the Cordillera Blanca, and structured their entire itinerary around reaching Tocllaraju at the right moment. But they had not simply arrived and pointed themselves at the summit. What they had done in the weeks before June 18th speaks to exactly the kind of climbers they were. They had built an acclimatization ladder, a structured, progressive plan to condition their bodies for altitude before ever attempting their main objective. For you and me, altitude sickness might sound like a headache and some fatigue. For a climber above 5,000 meters, the consequences of poor acclimatization can be fatal. The body needs time to produce more red blood cells, to learn to extract oxygen from air that is dramatically thinner than anything at sea level. The way experienced mountaineers manage this is by ascending incrementally, climbing to progressively higher altitudes, descending to sleep, then climbing higher again. Daniel had been documenting this process on social media. On June 7th, the couple were on Nevado Mateo at 5,150 meters. 2 days later, they climbed Nevado Tocllaraju. Tokaraju, at 6,034 meters, was the final and highest step. the culmination of a deliberate 2-week buildup through progressively more demanding terrain. This is textbook Andean mountaineering practice. Not reckless, not impulsive, methodical. They had completed the progression correctly. They had hired a Peruvian guide named Florentino Caldua, a local professional with intimate knowledge of these specific mountains and these specific conditions. They had equipped themselves with satellite communication devices, which, as you will see, made the difference between 1 survival and 3 deaths. By the time they turned their attention to Tocllaraju, every element that experienced mountaineers are supposed to have in place was in place. The preparation phase of this expedition was, by any reasonable standard, a model of how to approach a 6,000-meter objective in the Cordillera Blanca. And yet, somewhere on the upper mountain, something was already waiting for them that no amount of preparation could neutralize. There is one more detail about June in the Cordillera Blanca that matters before we get to what happened on the morning of the 18th. The recommended climbing window for this range runs June through September, the dry season, when storm risk is lower and snow conditions are generally most stable. Summit attempts in this season typically happen in the early hours of the morning, often beginning well before midnight. Climbers start in complete darkness to take advantage of frozen, firmer snow before the heat of the day begins to soften the surface. Firmer snow holds anchor points better, is less likely to avalanche, and gives the rope team more reliable footing on steep terrain. Starting before dawn is not simply tradition. It is a calculated safety measure used by professionals throughout the range. On June 18th, Daniel, Sandra, and Florentino began their summit push in exactly this way. June 18th, 2026. Approximately 5:40 in the morning, the rope team was moving on the upper slopes of Tocllaraju, somewhere above 5,900 meters, pressing toward the summit in the pre-dawn darkness. They were inside what should have been the safest possible window. Early morning, dry season, full acclimatization completed. Professional local guide on the rope. Then the mountain moved. A massive avalanche released somewhere above them. A wall of snow, ice, and debris swept down the slope at speed. For Daniel and Sandra, there was no time. The cascade hit them and buried them in the snow. Florentino Caldua survived. How exactly he survived, whether he was positioned on a slightly different section of the rope, or managed to shelter in a micro-feature of the terrain, or was simply in the fraction of the slope that the flow passed around rather than over, is not yet documented in any available reporting. What matters is that he was alive, alone, and at 6,000 meters. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what an avalanche actually is at this altitude, and why it is so disproportionately lethal compared to almost any other mountain hazard. An avalanche above 5,900 meters is not a ski slope closure event. The snow up here is cold compressed and dense, often mixed with ice fragments the size of boulders, and it moves at speeds that can exceed 150 kilometers per hour on steep terrain. On a slope like Toclaraju's upper mountain, there is nowhere to go. The landscape is ridge and drop, with a fall line going in only one direction. The burial depth in high-altitude avalanches can also be extreme. Search teams operating in the Cordillera Blanca regularly encounter debris fields where the snow depth reaches several meters. Survival under that depth of coverage, without immediate surface rescue, is essentially zero. Daniel and Sandra did not survive the impact. There is also a climate dimension to what happened here that needs to be stated clearly. Because it is no longer a background detail in Andean mountaineering, it is a structural reality. The Cordillera Blanca has been fundamentally destabilized by climate change. Glacial retreat since the late 19th century has been dramatic and continuous. What this means practically for climbers is that ice structures that were stable for generations are no longer stable. Crevasses are more open and harder to detect. Seracs, towers of unstable glacial ice that can reach the height of a 12-story building, are collapsing more frequently and with less warning than historical patterns would suggest. So severe has this deterioration become that all climbing above 5,000 meters in Huascarán National Park was prohibited until the end of March 2026. That ban had been lifted by the time this expedition set out in June. The mountain was open, but the mountain was not the same mountain it had been. What happened in the minutes after the avalanche struck is a sequence the available evidence describes with unusual clarity. Florentino Caldua was alive. He knew immediately what had happened to the two people on his rope. At 6,000 meters in darkness, in the immediate aftermath of a major avalanche, the slope around him was still active. He could not dig them out alone. He activated his satellite phone and sent a distress signal. Rescue authorities received it. A specialist mountain team was dispatched to his location. They reached him, extracted him from the mountain, and confirmed he was alive and stable. But Daniel and Sandra were still on Tokaraju, beneath the snow, and the weather was already moving in around the upper mountain in a way that would complicate everything that came next. The rescue and recovery operation that followed was one of the most complex in recent Peruvian mountaineering history. Porfirio Cacha Macedo, president of the Association of Mountain Guides of Ancash, described it as exceptionally difficult. Unstable snow, jagged rock, thick ice, and the constant risk of a second avalanche event were all factors working against search teams. Rescuers eventually located one body, that of Sandra Covone. The search for Daniel Navarro was a different story. Operations for his recovery were temporarily suspended, not abandoned, suspended with the explicit statement from the Association of Mountain Guides of Peru that if weather conditions improved, teams would depart in the early hours to resume the search. Mexican and Canadian authorities initiated coordination with local officials and with the victims' families for the eventual repatriation of the remains. The mountain community's response was measured and respectful throughout. Organizations involved in the recovery operation specifically requested that the public exercise responsibility in how they discussed and shared information about the case, a recognition that behind the news headline, there were families in Mexico and Canada receiving the worst possible call from the other side of the world. When you lay the full sequence of events in order, what emerges is a picture that resists every simple narrative. These were not careless people. They were not ignoring the risks. They had not made obvious errors. And yet, 4 contributing factors had been working against them before they ever set foot on the upper mountain. To understand this tragedy properly, you have to name all 4. The first is the mountain itself. Tokaraju has a documented history of exactly this type of incident. A prior case involving a group of Estonian mountaineers saw climbers fall into a crevasse nearly 20 meters deep after an avalanche disturbed the peak. One was rescued with fractured ribs. Others were not immediately accounted for. Tokaraju generates avalanches. Its upper slope geometry funnels snow and ice directly toward the standard climbing routes in ways that are difficult to anticipate and impossible to fully avoid on any given morning. The second factor is the hour. Summit attempts at 5:40 in the morning are standard, rational, and recommended. But they also mean that if something goes wrong, rescue is happening in darkness, at altitude, on terrain that is still frozen and therefore still releasing. The safest time to climb is simultaneously the hardest time to mount a rescue. The third factor is climate change, and I want to be direct about this because it is no longer a background element. It is a central one. Glacial retreat in the Cordillera Blanca has been severe for over a century. The historical record here is sobering. Roughly 30 glacier disasters have killed nearly 30,000 people in this region since 1941. The majority not from climbing accidents, but from glacial lake outburst floods in the valleys below. For climbers, the consequences manifest differently. Less predictable snow, less stable ice, bergschrunds appearing in positions that older maps do not show. The 2025 season was documented by experienced climbers in the range as highly unusual, with abnormally heavy snow above 5,500 meters as late as May. A rare event that elevated avalanche risk throughout the range going into the June window Daniel and Sandra had planned around. The fourth factor is the cruelest one. Daniel and Sandra had done almost everything the mountaineering community would ask of a serious expedition team. Acclimatized properly over 2 weeks through 2 intermediate peaks at progressively greater elevations, a professional local guide, satellite communication. The only reason Florentino Caldua came home alive. Climbing in season at the correct hour, on a route that is considered a legitimate and respected objective. And yet, when you assess what actually defines safety on a mountain like Tocllaraju in 2026, none of those factors can fully compensate for an unstable snowpack on an inherently dangerous upper slope. There is a phrase experienced Andean climbers use: the mountain does not negotiate. It means that all the preparation in the world only takes you to the starting line. What happens above 5,900 meters in the dark is ultimately the mountain's decision. The tragedy on Tokaraju on June 18, 2026, was not the result of inexperience, carelessness, or a single catastrophic mistake. It was the result of two prepared, professional, serious climbers encountering a slope that had reached the end of its tolerance, in a range that is measurably less stable than it was a generation ago, on a morning that gave them no warning and no margin. Sandra Covone and Daniel Navarro deserve to be remembered as the accomplished mountaineers they were, not as cautionary examples of poor judgment, because that is simply not what happened here. The mountain moved. That is the honest truth of this story. Given everything that the Cordillera Blanca is becoming as climate change accelerates, do you think the current permit and access system is doing enough to protect climbers operating in the range? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.